thank you for the very good discussions. I have a question. I was a bit astounded you mentioned Saudi Arabia in the equation, and Qatar, which is of course more of a financial actor. But Saudi Arabia is definitely a geopolitical actor. And what worries me is not the idea of the possibility of reconciliation in two, but a polarization of the Middle East, and the possibility of the Middle East becoming the new Balkans, as opposed to an area of balance in power. And we're seeing that in the last November Islamic Arab meeting, when Saudi Arabia and Iran are coming together, and they're polarizing the situation with Israel, which is Israel's fault for doing what it's doing in Gaza. So my view is the situation is polarizing, and not just polarizing there, but around the world. To get back to your first point, your talk, the global situation is polarizing, and the more this multipolarity, so-called multipolarity, counter the U.S. backing Japan, Taiwan, Australia, etc., versus Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. The more those link together, the more they fuel each other, the more the possibility of catastrophe is coming. So I just want to point that out because we have to look globally. And so it's very important here that the U.S. itself, and this is where I agree with you, the U.S. begin to engage with all the major actors, whether it's Iran, China, Russia, even North Korea, in order to prevent this polarization from taking place. So I just wanted your comments on that, and see where we can move towards peace, as opposed to my view, where we're not only polarizing the Middle East, but we're polarizing the global situation. And just to say one more point, I'm not, from my previous comments earlier, I am for the U.S. and China compromising on Taiwan. If we don't do that, this polarization is going to take place. I'll make that clear. So I'm not actually pro-Taiwan. I'm for China, Taiwan talking to each other.
I completely agree with you on that, Taiwan. I think the danger of polarization is the worst thing, because there is some degree of re-regionalization going on, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's an inevitable thing. But it doesn't have to be so polarized if it is removed from, shall we say, overly ideological conceptions of what rivalry is. We're starting to see this with the Gulf Cooperation Council, for example. We're used to, people of my generation anyway, are used to seeing Saudi Arabia as perhaps the most ideological actor on the world stage. So it's been interesting to see it really pivot into a much more pragmatic position and very much open for business and diplomacy with lots of different people. I think that's a good sign. If that can happen with Saudi Arabia, that can happen with anyone. And I think what happens with the U.S. alliance network in particular, but theoretically any big globe-spanning alliance network has this potential, is that what can happen is that people become dependent on the alliance network, its assumptions on how the world works, as well as kind of offshoring a lot of their concept of the national interest. And people are seeing the relative, I think statements of American decline can be greatly exaggerated, but a definite relative decline of the U.S. on the world stage. And I think that's actually, a lot of people are like, okay, we have to step up. We have to be a bit more pragmatic. Most of the world does not, in fact, want to follow the current example of, say, Germany, and perhaps the German Green Party in particular, and double down on this kind of psychological dependency. They actually want to meet the challenge and engage with it. And I think the more people do that, the less polarized not every issue, but many issues could be, because they're going to have to be forced to be pragmatic. They want what is best for their citizens or their regime, whatever, and therefore they can't fuel as much these divisive international movements like we saw with countries that supported the moderate rebels, quote unquote, in Syria.
If I may very briefly, I'm convinced that most of regional actors are not interested in polarization. And the only way is to avoid any kind of block approach is to keep the back doors open. And as far as I see, for example, Iran is doing so. Iran did not engage directly when the October 7 happened. Iran did not engage directly when Israeli troops were in Lebanon soil, because there is a new different dimension of confrontation. And the same is as I see from the US side, when, for example, US was pushing Israel to not strike, for example, some facilities inside Iran. So, and when sometimes we see that different countries are talking about polarization and blocks, probably they try to simplify the complicated picture, like to make it black and white. But the problem is, we see how interested colleague mentioned, they might be changed. For example, since the start of the Syrian war, obviously Erdogan was interested to take part of the Syria as Turkey did in Hatay, now they're occupying northern part. Like Israel was interested to collapse Assad regime, etc., etc. But now Turkey is a part of Astana Forum. So they are trying to handle somehow the situation on the ground. The same is with Iran. But in Syria, the interests do not coincide, they clash. So they cannot be blocks, because they need to cooperate somehow. And the only way is to cooperate and to not polarize the region, to avoid it, is to keep back doors open.